everyone, welcome to the Rabbit Hutch Sews. Today I'm going to be showing you how I did this cutout modification on the Lucy tank from Sonia Estep Designs. The Lucy is a beautiful tank for summer. It is a swing tank, can be styled down or styled up for a date night. I am going to link the pattern for you in the description, so let's get started. Okay, so I am using a projector instead of a pattern piece, but it's the same idea as if you were using a pattern piece. No different really. So I'm going to go ahead and line the piece up on the fold, and then I'm going to measure how far down I want the opening to come. So I'm going to do about 3.5 inches and just place a dot. Make sure I'm marking right along the edge to where I want the opening to come down to. So it's going to be about 3.5 inches tall. Now I'm going to measure how wide I want the opening. And I am going to do 1 1/8 inches from the fold, so it'll be 2¼ inches wide once it's open. And I'm going to go ahead and mark a dot there. Now I'm going to draw a line from dot to dot. It's not going to be perfectly straight. It's going to kind of curve down a little bit, but you want to match those 2 points up. Now, after you draw this line, you will go ahead and trace the rest of your pattern piece just as normal. So you'll go ahead, draw that line between the 2 dots, and that is where you will cut out. So we're going to go ahead and trace the rest of the pattern just like you would if you weren't doing this modification. Now, when you're cutting it out, you will cut out that opening. So you'll cut along the lines so you have that opening. Now we are going to measure our area for the binding. So that front opening we cut, I'm going to go ahead and measure along there. It's about 8 inches. So I'm going to do about 90% of that, 7.2 inches. So I'm going to cut my binding at 7 inches long. So that binding piece is going to be 90% of the opening that we cut. All right, so I'm going to cut my binding piece now. Now we figured out it's going to be 7 inches long. So I'd like to use my quilting ruler to measure that out on the fold. So because I'm cutting it on the fold, it's going to be 3.5 inches. And then I think I'll make it 1.5 inches wide. I don't want it too wide, but I want it easy to work with. So in total, our binding will be 7 inches by 1.5 inches tall. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that out. Okay, so we now need a strip, or in my case, I'm going to do strips of fabric to go across our opening. Now I'm going to do an ombre with mine, so I'm going to cut 3 different strips. But if you're doing just all the same fabric, you could cut 1 long strip and then cut it down to size. So I'm going to go ahead and do 3 strips. I'm just going to make them generously long because I can cut them to size as I need them. I'm going to do each of them 1.25 inches wide. So if you're doing, again, if you're doing just 1 strip, you can just do 1 long strip, 1.25 inches wide, and then you can cut it down to size after you make it. But like I said, I'm going to do an ombre strips, so I'm cutting 3 different strips. So now we are going to go ahead and make our strips that are going to be the accent pieces along our opening. And I am going to take my strip. If you have more than 1 strip, you'll do the same thing for all 3. I'm going to place it right sides together. And then I'm just going to go ahead and stitch it closed along the raw edges. I'm going to use a longer straight stitch for this. And then I'm just going to go ahead and sew along the raw edges to create a tube. So we have our piece now. If you are just doing one, then you're done. If you have more than one, then go ahead and repeat. Same thing for the other ones. Now I don't know what I did with my little strip turner, so I'm just going to use a safety pin here. Safety pin to one end and then feed it through itself to turn it right sides out. So now that you have this strip, you can cut it down to size, whatever size you need for your opening. So I have my shirt front, and we're going to go ahead and attach our binding to the opening we cut out. So I'm going to place my binding right sides of the binding to the wrong side of the shirt front opening, and I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place along the opening, and you will need to stretch a little bit as you go. Now we are going to sew the binding to our bodice at about 3/8 of an inch in. Now to finish our binding, we're going to flip our shirt right side up, fold the top of the binding down, and then fold it over again over your stitching line. Now I did not press my binding, but you could press your binding just like in the tutorial. I didn't because I like to fly by the seat of my pants, but it's the same idea whether you press or don't press. Just having the press can make it easier to fold that top line over. So once you have your binding pinned completely in place, you can take that over to your sewing machine or cover stitch machine and sew along the edge of the binding, securing it to the bodice. So now we are going to do our neck binding, and it will be similar to the tutorial. We're first going to match up our notches to each of the points, just like you would if we hadn't done this modification. Now, normally you would have the whole front to attach to, but because we cut out, we don't have that whole front to attach to, so we'll do a little bit differently. You're just going to go ahead and stretch the binding piece a little bit, and then pin to where the opening starts. And then just pin that in place. Sorry, stretch to the opening and pin in place. It doesn't need to stretch a lot, just a little bit of a stretch. Then we will go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, where we match up the raw edge of our neck binding to the raw edge of our front, stretching just a little bit to the edge of our opening and pinning that in place. So once you have finished pinning it in place, you're going to be sewing across the binding. This is what it will look like from the front. So you will sew in the crease that you made when we pressed our binding, and then you will flip and attach the binding just like you did with the arms and the opening. At this point, we're also going to pin across the back and sew there as well. Okay, so I am just going to go ahead and sew right in the crease we pressed across both of the front pieces, and you will do across the back as well. So now we will do the binding just like we did our other bindings. Fold the press line and then fold the next line that you pressed over the top and covering your stitching mark and pinning that into place. Again, you just fold to the center mark and then down again over the front of the bodice. Now when we do the binding over our opening, we're going to do the same thing, except instead of folding over the bodice, you'll just match up the two edges of the binding, pin it in place, and when you sew, you'll just sew right over along the edge, securing it closed and in place. So we will continue pinning our binding in place all around the neckline, and then we will top stitch it along the edge. So I have pressed my neckband and my opening, and now we are going to go ahead and add our little accent strips across the opening. So I'm going to flip my opening so that it is wrong side up, and I'm going to lay my piece where I'd like it, and then I'm going to go ahead and pin both sides in place. Now I'm making sure to pull it taut, not overly tight, but you don't want it too loose either. Okay, once you've pinned it in place, flip it over and check to make sure you like the positioning, that it's even, and then you will flip it back over and continue to do the same thing for however many strips you have, and you'll just adjust them until they are in a position that you like, they're straight and evenly spaced apart. So once you have your strips in a position that you like them, you're just going to go ahead and top stitch over the existing line of stitching. Now I was being lazy and did not change my cover stitch. It was purple, my thing is blue. It's going to be more obvious, but it's fine. But you could just stitch over the previous line of stitching, and then when you're done, you can flip it over and cut off any excess of the strips. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe. Thank you.